A 66-year-old black father nearly dropped his phone when he heard his own son's voice sneering that he was nothing but a burden and should be dumped in a rundown place for $800 a month. The man who had worked double shifts, skipped meals, and sold his wedding band to put that boy through college was now being plotted against like an unwanted package. Every word of that message cut deeper than a knife, and the silence that followed was heavier than death itself. What he chose to do next would change everything. Subscribe and drop a simple number or where you're watching from. He sat alone in the dim light of his kitchen, the old clock on the wall ticking with a rhythm that matched the ache in his chest. James Walker stared at the phone on the table, still replaying the vile message he had overheard. $800 a month. That was the price his own son had placed on his life, the cost of removing him from the very home he had built. As the words echoed in his ears, his mind drifted back to the years when Marcus was still a boy, with wide eyes and endless needs, a boy James had vowed to protect with everything he had. There was a time when his days began at 4 a.m, pulling on steel-toed boots that had seen better days, driving across town to the auto plant, where sparks lit up the factory floor like stars in a steel sky. He worked until his arms trembled, until the grime sank into his skin so deep it wouldn't wash out no matter how hard he scrubbed. And when the whistle blew at night, most men dragged themselves home, but not James. He went straight to the offices downtown, a mop and a bucket his only companions. He moved through silent hallways, wiping down desks that belonged to men who wouldn't even remember his name. Every extra dollar was for Marcus. He remembered the winter his son needed braces. The orthodontist handed him a bill that made his knees weak, but James had smiled through it, nodding as if it were nothing. That same week he pawned his only watch, a gift from his father, and doubled his janitorial shifts to cover the cost. When Marcus begged for a computer in high school because everyone else had one, James sold his beloved set of drums, the last piece of his youth, so his son wouldn't feel left behind. And when college acceptance letters came, he wept with joy, even as the weight of tuition crushed his shoulders. The night he sold his wedding band was the one that still haunted him. His wife had passed years earlier, and that ring was more than gold. It was memory love, a piece of himself. He slipped it into the jeweler's hand without a word, his throat burning because Marcus's tuition was due and James had no other choice. He walked out of the store with a check in his pocket and a hole in his soul. Marcus never knew, and James never told him. He wanted his son to feel the pride of education, not the cost of sacrifice. He thought back to graduation day. The sun was hot, the field crowded with proud families. James wore his best suit, patched and pressed, and cheered louder than anyone when Marcus walked across the stage. Tears blurred his vision as he clapped, shouting his son's name, believing every sleepless night, every back-breaking shift, every empty pocket had been worth it. In that moment, he thought his sacrifices had built something unshakable between them, a bond that could never be broken. But bonds break. They shatter in silence long before anyone hears the crack. In the years that followed, James noticed subtle changes. Marcus no longer asked for advice. He dismissed his father's stories with impatient sighs. Family dinners became less frequent, phone calls, shorter visits, rushed. Then came Vanessa, polished, ambitious, and quick to remind James of his age. She never said it outright, but her glances around his old furniture and her remarks about modern living carried daggers. When they moved into his home temporarily, James convinced himself it was family coming together. But soon he found himself standing in corners of his own living room, watching his son and daughter-in-law rearrange furniture, replace curtains, and talk about the future as if he were a guest in his own house. Every night he told himself it was temporary, that Marcus was busy, that Vanessa was stressed, that it would get better. He clung to that belief like a drowning man clings to driftwood. And now, after hearing his son's voice on that recording, he knew the truth. They weren't planning to move out. They were planning to move him out. He could still see the envelope of pay stubs he had saved through the years tucked in a box in the attic. Proof of the hours, the sweat, the sacrifices. Each slip of paper a chapter of his devotion. He thought of the letters he had written to Marcus in college, the encouraging words, the checks enclosed. He thought of the nights he ate cold leftovers so Marcus could have warm meals in the dorms. He thought of the pride that had once swelled in his chest whenever he introduced his son to neighbors, saying, "This is my boy. He's going to be somebody." Now that same boy had grown into a man who could strip his dignity with a single message. The air in the kitchen grew heavy, pressing down on him until he could hardly breathe. His hands curled into fists, knuckles whitening, as the image of his wife filled his mind. She had always been the balance, the voice that reminded him to stand tall, to never let the world break him. He imagined her face, imagined her whispering, "You gave too much. Don't let them take what's left." James rose slowly from the chair, his body stiff from years of labor, but still carrying the strength of a man who had never truly broken. He walked through the house, his hand grazing the walls. He had painted the banister, he had built the photographs on the shelves. Memories clung to every corner, reminders of a life he had built with his own hands. He paused at the front door, staring into the darkness outside, and felt something shift inside him. The message was more than betrayal. It was a line drawn in the sand. He knew he couldn't erase the years of sacrifice. He couldn't reclaim the wedding band, the drums, the watch. He couldn't get back the hours of sleep or the nights spent cleaning floors for strangers. But he could decide what came next, and what came next would not be silence. As he stood there in the stillness, the shadows of the past seemed to gather around him, urging him to act. His heart was heavy, but his mind was sharp, cutting through the haze of sorrow with cold precision. For the first time in years, James Walker felt something stronger than exhaustion, stronger than despair. He felt resolve. The night stretched on, and the old clock ticked toward midnight. He poured himself a glass of water, steadying his breath, his eyes fixed on the phone that had betrayed him with its accidental recording. Tomorrow would come, and tomorrow he would no longer be the quiet father in the corner. Tomorrow he would be something else entirely. And when the sun rose, his son would have no idea what kind of storm was about to be unleashed. The memory of that day still burned bright in his mind, not as a gentle glow, but as a cruel reminder of how far things had fallen. James Walker had stood at the edge of the football field in the sweltering May heat, the bleachers filled with cheering families, the brass band blaring out its triumphant notes. His son Marcus strode across the stage in a black gown and a mortarboard tilted slightly to the side, his tassel swaying as the principal called his name. James clapped so hard his palms stung his voice, carrying over the crowd, shouting his son's name with pride that felt endless. Tears had blurred his sight, and he didn't care if anyone saw. He thought every hour spent bent over machines at the plant, every night spent scrubbing floors in office buildings while the city slept, had finally been justified in that single shining moment. His son had made it. He remembered afterward the celebration in the church hall they had rented with money James didn't really have. There were folding tables draped with cheap white plastic cloths, paper plates stacked high, and the smell of fried chicken and collard greens filling the air. Family, neighbors, old friends from the block all came to see Marcus, the boy from the east side who had beaten the odds. James handed him an envelope with a crisp $100 bill inside, money he should have kept for rent but gave anyway just to let his son know how much he believed in him. Marcus had hugged him, quickly distracted, already caught up in the circle of friends slapping his back, already basking in the attention. Still, James didn't let it shake him. He thought, let him enjoy it. He's earned this. He could still see the look in his son's eyes that night. There was ambition there, hunger for more than what their neighborhood had to offer, and James mistook it for the kind of fire that would lift the whole family higher. He told everyone who would listen that his boy was going to be somebody. He even repeated it to himself on long nights alone when exhaustion blurred his vision as he counted dollar bills by the kitchen light. That belief carried him through the years. But pride has a sharp edge, and sometimes it cuts the one who holds it. He thought of the times Marcus had come home from college on breaks wearing new sneakers James hadn't bought, carrying himself like he was already above the world he'd left behind. James noticed how his son's words grew slicker, how he started talking about opportunities, connections, investments. It was the language of someone reaching for more, and James thought it meant security, success, a life better than his own. He couldn't see then that woven into those words was a growing distance, a quiet disdain for the father who had paid the price of admission. The day Marcus got his first real job offer, James remembered beaming with pride. They sat at the kitchen table where the wood had worn down from years of use, the letter spread out between them. Marcus had looked at him with a smile that seemed genuine then, and James had swallowed the lump in his throat too full of joy to notice the impatience in his son's eyes. He had toasted with a glass of sweet tea, lifting it high as if it were champagne. That night he'd gone to bed lighter than he'd felt in decades, believing his son's future was a monument to everything he had sacrificed. But now, sitting in that same kitchen years later with the phone on the table like a loaded gun, the weight of betrayal crushed him. That pride, that unshakable belief in his son's honor, twisted inside him like a blade. He remembered his late wife's smile at graduation, her whisper in his ear telling him their boy would never forget what they had done for him. She had believed it too. And now she was gone, her faith silenced, leaving James alone to face the truth she never had to witness. He walked into the living room where an old photo album sat gathering dust. He pulled it from the shelf, the cover frayed at the edges, the spine cracking as he opened it. Page after page of Marcus's life stared back at him. A boy grinning with a missing tooth, a teenager holding up a basketball trophy, a young man in a graduation gown standing tall under the sun. Each photograph told the story of a father's devotion, but tonight they looked like evidence in a case against him. Proof that he had invested everything in a future that no longer belonged to him. James traced his finger over the graduation photo, his eyes narrowing as a storm gathered inside. How had that smiling boy grown into a man who could plot against his own father? How had the pride of his life become the architect of his ruin? The answer clawed at him, and though part of him wanted to cling to the memory of that sunny day, the sharper part of him refused. Pride had blinded him, made him deaf to the warning signs, and now he saw clearly for the first time. The house was quiet, the silence thick, the only sound the faint hum of the refrigerator. James stood in the center of the room, the photo album still open in his hands. For the first time in years, his vision wasn't clouded by tears. It was sharp, clear, cutting through the haze like a blade. That pride he once felt for Marcus no longer lived here. In its place grew something darker, steadier, more dangerous. He closed the album, slid it back onto the shelf, and stood tall. His knees ached, his back stiff, but his spirit surged with new energy. The pride that had once fueled his sacrifices was gone, but what replaced it was stronger. It was the will to reclaim what was his, the determination to show his son that the man he called a burden was still capable of building and of destroying. The night air pressed against the windows, the wind rattling the glass like a warning. James Walker stared at the darkness outside, and for the first time in years, he felt no doubt. Pride had carried him far, but betrayal had given him purpose. And what he planned to do next would turn that purpose into something his son would never see coming. The distance didn't arrive with a bang. It crept in quietly like a draft through a crack in the window, chilling the air 1 degree at a time until the house no longer felt like home. James Walker remembered when Sundays meant the smell of pot roast filling the kitchen. Marcus, at the head of the table with his booming laugh. Vanessa smiling politely, pretending to belong. They would pass cornbread, share stories, argue about football. It wasn't perfect, but it was family. Then slowly, almost imperceptibly, those dinners stopped. The first time Marcus claimed a work project kept him late. The next time, Vanessa had a migraine. After that, it was easier for them to simply not show up at all. The phone calls were worse. At first, Marcus would talk for 10-15 minutes, laughing, asking about his father's week, telling him about the job. Then the conversations dwindled into rushed exchanges, each one shorter than the last. Sometimes Marcus didn't answer at all, returning the call days later with a hollow excuse. James would hang up, staring at the silent phone, the empty chair across from him, and wonder when his son's voice had begun to sound like a stranger's. He noticed how Vanessa had sharpened with time. In the early days, she had smiled sweetly, pretending respect, but later her words carried edges. She'd glance around James's modest home and comment on how dated everything looked, her tone smooth but heavy with criticism. She once suggested tearing down the porch he had built with his bare hands because it looked unsafe. Another time she hinted that the neighborhood wasn't right for raising children, though they never had any. It wasn't just what she said, it was the way Marcus agreed with her without hesitation, his eyes flicking toward his father as if James was already irrelevant. Loneliness began to seep into the cracks of James's routine. He would cook too much food on Sundays, setting out plates that stayed empty, pushing leftovers into the fridge until they spoiled. He took to sitting by the window in the evenings, watching the streetlights flicker on, one by one, waiting for headlights that never appeared. His neighbors noticed the old couple across the street nodding sympathetically when they saw him sitting outside alone, but no one said a word. In that silence, his house felt less like a home and more like a museum filled with echoes. The distance wasn't just emotional, it became physical. Marcus and Vanessa began staying away longer, visiting only for birthdays or obligatory holidays, their smiles brittle, their hugs quick. When they did come, Vanessa spent most of the time scrolling on her phone while Marcus pretended to watch television. James found himself reduced to background noise, someone they tolerated rather than cherished. Once during Thanksgiving, Marcus suggested they host at their own place next year, his tone light but final, as if James's home no longer held value for tradition. That cut deeper than he admitted. He noticed how conversations shifted too. When James spoke of the past, of the years of sacrifice, Marcus would roll his eyes or change the subject. When he offered advice, his son would respond with condescension, phrases like, "Things don't work that way anymore, Dad." It was as if everything James had lived, every hardship endured, every lesson learned, belonged to a different species not worth hearing. That dismissal hurt more than outright cruelty. Nights became harder. James would sit in the dark, the glow of the television washing over him, and think about the boy who used to sit on his lap, listening wide-eyed to stories. He remembered holding Marcus's hand as they crossed busy streets, remembered the pride in his son's eyes when he hit his first home run. Where had that boy gone? And what remained in his place? What he couldn't ignore were the hints of Vanessa's growing control. Mail began arriving addressed jointly to Marcus and Vanessa, even though the deed and bills were still in his name. James noticed Vanessa asking subtle questions about insurance, property taxes, and the house's market value. At first he brushed it off as idle curiosity, but in retrospect it felt calculated, deliberate, as if she were mapping out a plan brick by brick. Marcus's silence in those moments was worse than any betrayal. His son wasn't just complicit, he was comfortable with it. The subtle signs added up until the weight of them pressed down like concrete. James's pride in his son had been built on the foundation of love and sacrifice, but now hairline fractures spread across that foundation, threatening to collapse it entirely. He saw it in their absence at Christmas when his living room stayed quiet, and the only sound came from the old clock ticking past midnight. He saw it in Marcus's face, lit by the glow of his phone, indifferent to the stories of the man who had given him everything. And then came the final insult, the moment James knew the distance was no longer subtle. It was a wall. One spring evening, Marcus had stopped by briefly, Vanessa waiting in the car. James offered him dinner, a simple stew he had made, but Marcus shook his head, glancing at his watch. "We've got plans, Dad. We'll catch you another time." Another time never came. As James watched his son walk down the steps, disappearing into the night, he realized he was no longer family in their eyes. He was an obligation. He sat in that silence long after the car had gone, his chest heavy, his hands trembling slightly as he clutched the arms of his chair. For years he had convinced himself that love was enough, that the bond between father and son could not be broken. But now he understood that distance had turned into exile, that pride had blinded him to betrayal, inching closer with every excuse, every missed dinner, every unanswered call. The distance had hollowed out the space between them, but it also carved something new into him, something sharper. And when he finally saw the truth, the man they thought was fading into the background began to take shape in the shadows. What he intended to do next would make them wish they had never underestimated him. The word temporary hung in the air like smoke, but James Walker soon learned that nothing about his son and daughter-in-law's stay felt fleeting. They arrived with boxes, stacked high wardrobes that filled closets meant for him, and a confidence that turned every corner of his home into their stage. At first he told himself it was fine. Family leaned on each other, and maybe the house would feel alive again with laughter and footsteps echoing through the halls. But what came wasn't laughter. It was whispers, criticism, and the slow erasure of everything he had built. It started with comments about the furniture. Vanessa would run her manicured fingers across the arm of the sofa and wrinkle her nose. "This couch is outdated, James. It makes the whole room feel small." Marcus, instead of defending the father who had sat on that couch night after night, nodded in agreement and pulled out his phone to browse for modern replacements. When James tried to protest, they told him change was necessary, that he didn't understand what looks good anymore. Soon his living room didn't look like his living room at all. The sofa was gone, replaced with a sleek sectional he had never chosen. His old oak coffee table vanished one morning without explanation. Even the curtains his late wife had sewn by hand disappeared, tossed aside for sterile blinds that made the house feel more like an office than a home. The indignities grew sharper. His mail began arriving in neat piles that had already been opened. Vanessa insisted on helping with the bills, claiming she was more organized, and James found envelopes slid open before he even touched them. When he asked about it, Marcus dismissed him with a shrug. "It's easier this way, Dad. Don't stress yourself." But the message was clear. His own name on the envelopes meant nothing. Authority in his own house was slipping through his fingers like sand. The whispers were worse. He would enter the room and hear their voices fall, silent glances exchanged with tight smiles that never reached their eyes. He caught fragments about the value of the property, about how much longer he might manage on his own, about how the neighborhood is changing. They thought he couldn't hear, or perhaps they didn't care if he did. Each overheard word was another nail hammered into his dignity. One evening he walked into the kitchen and found Vanessa rearranging the pantry, moving his jars and spices into boxes on the floor. She looked up and said casually, "We need more space for ourselves. You don't really cook much anymore, do you?" He stared at her hands on the shelves his wife had once tended with pride, and something inside him burned. But he stayed silent, swallowing the humiliation, because speaking up would have meant acknowledging just how much ground he had already lost. The worst moments came at night. He would sit in his own chair, one of the few pieces they hadn't replaced yet, and listen to their laughter carry from the other room, laughter that excluded him. They watched television shows he didn't choose, filled the house with music that drowned out his thoughts, and moved through the space as though he were an unwelcome guest. The home he had built brick by brick, with sweat dripping from his brow in the summers and calluses etched into his palms, now echoed with voices that made him feel invisible. There were nights he crept upstairs and shut the door just to escape them, listening to their footsteps below, like strangers occupying a house they'd broken into. He'd press his hands against the walls, remembering the day he had laid them, and wonder how a man could feel so exiled in a place that bore his name. His humiliation deepened with the subtle performances of control. Marcus began handling small repairs without asking, replacing fixtures, repainting walls, even hiring a handyman without his consent. Each change was announced afterward, as though James had no say. When neighbors came by, it was Marcus who greeted them, smiling wide, speaking, as if the house belonged to him. The neighbors, polite but uneasy, glanced toward James with looks that carried questions they didn't dare ask. The insult cut even deeper when Vanessa hosted her family for dinner one weekend without even consulting him. He came home from an errand to find strangers sitting at his table drinking his wine, complimenting her on such a lovely home. James stood in the doorway, his chest tight, while Vanessa laughed and guided them through each room like a proud hostess. Marcus barely looked at him, and when their eyes met, there was no shame there, only a smug assurance that this was the way things were now. Each small humiliation stacked higher until the weight was unbearable. But he didn't break. He observed. He cataloged every slight, every whisper, every insult disguised as help. They thought they were diminishing him, but what they were really doing was chiseling away the last illusions he had left. That night, after Vanessa's family finally left and the house fell into silence, James sat at the kitchen table staring at the new blinds that blocked out the stars. His hands trembled not from weakness but from the fury he held back. The humiliation was complete, the verdict handed down without words in their eyes. He no longer owned his home, his life, or even his place in the family. But beneath that humiliation, something sharp and unyielding stirred. He realized that every change they forced upon him, every criticism, every stolen moment of authority was a mistake they would regret. They thought he was powerless, cornered, erased. They had no idea what kind of man they were provoking, no idea what he was capable of once pushed too far. And as the clock ticked toward midnight, James Walker leaned back in his chair, the flicker of resolve in his eyes stronger than any humiliation. The storm gathering inside him was no longer just about survival. It was about taking back everything they had tried to strip away. What he would set in motion next would make the whispers stop forever. The voice message played once, then twice, until the words etched themselves into his skull like a carving that would never fade. James Walker sat frozen, his phone pressed against his ear, the tone in his son's voice colder than he had ever heard. Marcus wasn't just talking about moving him out of his own house. He was planning the theft of everything James had built. The words rolled out smooth, casual, like business as usual. "Daryl's got it handled at the clerk's office. Once the paperwork's in, it's ours. He won't even know until it's too late." Daryl. That name alone made James's stomach turn. His cousin had always been slick, a man who knew how to bend rules without leaving fingerprints. As a county clerk, he had access to records, deeds, signatures, the very lifeblood of ownership. James had trusted him once years ago during family cookouts when Daryl slapped him on the back and bragged about being the one who could make things happen. He never imagined that those words would someday point like a dagger straight at his chest. The house wasn't just a property, it was the sum of decades. He saw it all in flashes, the foundation poured in a sweltering July sun, his back nearly breaking as he hauled cinder blocks. The porch he'd hammered together while his wife held nails between her lips, laughing at his curses when the wood splintered. The roof he patched after a storm ripped shingles into the street. Every corner bore his fingerprints, his sweat, his blood. To hear his son reduce it all to a line in a whispered scheme was worse than betrayal. It was desecration. He set the phone on the table, his hands trembling but not from age. Rage coursed through him, hot and sharp, but beneath it was something heavier, a cold clarity that stripped away any lingering illusions. The message wasn't just cruel, it was confirmation. Marcus and Vanessa weren't drifting away by accident. They weren't thoughtless or busy. They were predators circling a man they assumed was too old, too tired, too blind to notice. James leaned back in his chair, the kitchen light flickering overhead, and played the message again. This time he listened not as a father, but as a man hearing evidence in a trial. Every syllable was proof. Every pause was calculation. He imagined Marcus's lips curling as he said the words, imagined Daryl's sly grin, imagined Vanessa sitting nearby with her arms crossed, already picturing herself hosting dinners in a house she didn't build. The humiliation he had swallowed in silence hardened into something unbreakable. They thought the house was worth $480,000, but to James it was priceless, a monument to survival, a sanctuary carved out of decades of sacrifice. And now they were trying to steal it with a forged signature, a rigged file, a cheap trick disguised as legality. He stood, slowly walked into the living room and looked around. The blinds Vanessa had installed cast sharp lines across the floor, splitting the space into shadows and light. He saw the emptiness of his home stripped of his wife's curtains, his furniture, his peace. For the first time he didn't mourn the loss. He calculated. They had taken pieces from him for months, but now he had the truth in his hand, recorded and undeniable. That phone was no longer just a device. It was a weapon. James thought back to lessons his father once taught him. Never fight a battle without knowing the ground, never show your hand until it's too late. His son and cousin had broken those rules. They believed in silence and secrecy in papers shuffled quietly in back offices. But James knew now, and knowing was everything. He sat down again, calmer this time, and replayed the message a third time. The words no longer wounded him, they sharpened him. He began to see each phrase as a blueprint of their scheme, each detail a thread he could pull to unravel the entire fabric. They wanted him erased. Instead, they had written their own downfall in their own voices. Outside, the wind rattled the windows, a low howl like the warning of a coming storm. James reached for a notepad, his pen scratching across the paper. He wrote down names, dates, dollar amounts, details that could bury a man if placed in the right hands. He wasn't just planning to defend himself anymore. He was preparing to strike back with precision. The night dragged on, but he didn't feel tired. He moved through the house like a man cataloging evidence at a crime scene, noting every place they had invaded his life, every change they had forced. Each note tightened his resolve. They thought of him as a burden. Soon they would understand what it meant to underestimate the man who had carried them for so long. He picked up the phone again, not to replay the message, but to scroll through his contacts. His thumb hovered over one name. Anthony Brooks, an old friend turned attorney who had once told James, "If you ever find yourself in trouble, you call me before anyone else." He didn't press the button yet. Timing mattered, but knowing the option was there steadied him. As dawn began to creep through the blinds, James sat in the chair that had always been his, the phone resting on the table beside him. He wasn't broken anymore. He wasn't humiliated. He wasn't erased. The recording had burned away the last of his weakness, leaving only steel. And while his son and cousin slept peacefully, believing the plan was already theirs, James Walker was awake, eyes fixed on the rising sun, ready to begin something they could never predict. What he prepared to unleash would not only stop them, but leave scars they would carry for the rest of their lives. The kitchen was silent except for the hum of the refrigerator and the faint crackle of an old light bulb fighting to stay alive above his head. James Walker sat hunched at the table, his phone glowing in his hand, replaying the message again and again. Each time Marcus's voice spilled through the tiny speaker, the blade twisted deeper. "Once he's gone, we'll finally live in peace. No more listening to his old stories. No more Sunday meals." The words echoed like a sentence passed down from a judge who didn't even bother to look him in the eye. He had been called many things in his life, hardworking, stubborn, resilient, but erased never. And yet that was exactly what it felt like now, as though everything he had poured into his son's life had been wiped away with a single cruel declaration. His shoulders, broad even with age, sagged under the weight of it. He pressed his palm against his chest, half expecting to feel it cave in, crushed under betrayal, heavier than any load he had ever carried at the factory. He thought of the years his stories had filled this house, the laughter of his boy echoing against the walls, the lessons spoken late at night, after double shifts when his voice was hoarse, but his heart still full. To Marcus, they were just old stories. To James, they were the blueprint of survival, the heritage passed from one generation to the next. And now his son wanted silence, wanted absence, wanted him gone, so the air could be clear of the man who had given him everything. The phone slipped from his hand and clattered on the table, the sound breaking the stillness like a gunshot. He stared at it as though it were a weapon pointed at him, its glowing screen a reminder of his new reality. His breathing grew shallow, ragged, and his eyes blurred with tears he fought to hold back. Not because he was ashamed to cry, but because he knew once the dam broke, it might never stop. He rose unsteadily and walked across the kitchen, the floorboards creaking beneath his weight. He placed his hands on the counter, gripping the edge until his knuckles whitened, staring out through the blinds into the night. The street outside was empty, the world indifferent to the fact that his life had just been torn in two. He had carried engines heavier than himself, worked shifts that bent his spine, but nothing had ever left him this hollow. He stumbled into the living room, sank into his chair, and let his head fall back. The shadows stretched across the walls, swallowing the photographs that lined the shelves. He could barely make out the smiling faces captured in frozen time, his wife holding Marcus as a boy, the three of them at a picnic, Marcus in his first suit before prom. Each picture seemed to mock him now, proof of a devotion that had led to this moment of abandonment. The collapse wasn't loud. It was quiet, suffocating like a cave-in underground where no one hears the screams. James felt the edges of himself crumbling, the strength that had carried him through decades reduced to dust in his chest. He pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes, but the tears forced their way out anyway, hot and unrelenting carving tracks down his weathered face. His sobs were jagged, pulled from the deepest part of him, the part that still believed his son would never turn against him. Hours bled together as he sat there, body trembling, heartbreaking. He thought of calling someone, an old friend, a neighbor, anyone who might remind him he wasn't alone. But the shame was too heavy. How could he explain that his own son wanted him gone, that the boy he had raised now spoke of him as though he were a burden to be thrown away? He chose silence, letting the pain echo in the emptiness of his house, letting it consume him. The night stretched long, each minute dragging like a chain across stone. He didn't sleep. He drifted between numbness and sharp stabs of memory, each one reminding him of what he had lost. He pictured Marcus as a boy, curled up against him on the couch, asking him to tell one more story. He pictured Marcus as a teenager, proud behind the wheel of the first car James had scraped and saved to buy him. He pictured Marcus walking across that stage in cap and gown, the pride swelling in James's chest, so fierce it hurt. All of it gone now. All of it reduced to an inconvenience in his son's eyes. As dawn crept in, pale light spilling across the blinds, James sat motionless. His body felt heavy, as though every muscle had been weighed down with cement. His eyes were red, his throat raw, but the tears had finally dried. The collapse had run its course, leaving behind a silence deeper than the night before. He realized he had crossed a line, that there was no going back to blind hope or excuses. Something inside him had shattered, and the pieces would never fit the same again. He reached for the phone once more, staring at the recording. The words still stung, but now they no longer cut him open. They sat there like ash after a fire, a ruin that couldn't be ignored. He pressed the phone to his ear, listening one last time, not to torture himself, but to etch the betrayal into memory. He wanted to remember exactly how it felt to be erased, because the man who walked forward from this moment would never allow it again. The sun climbed higher, and James straightened in his chair. His body was tired, but somewhere beneath the exhaustion, something steadier had begun to take root. The collapse had gutted him, but in the hollow space left behind, there was room for something else to grow. And as he stared at the light cutting across his floor, his jaw tightened. What came next would not be tears. What came next would be something his son never saw coming. The first rays of dawn sliced through the blinds, painting pale streaks across the worn floorboards. James Walker sat at the edge of his bed, the weight of the night still heavy on his shoulders. But something inside him had shifted. Where grief had choked him only hours before, a colder, sharper force had risen in its place. His wife's voice lingered in his mind, steady as a hymn. Never let anyone strip you of your dignity, not even family. Those words were no longer memory. They were command. He rose slowly, his knees stiff but his movements deliberate, and opened the old cedar wardrobe. Hanging there untouched for months was the navy suit he had once worn to his wife's funeral. He ran a calloused hand down the sleeve, the fabric smooth beneath his fingers, and felt a strange calm wash over him. The suit was more than clothing. It was armor. He slipped into it, button by button, knotting the tie with the same precision he once used to set beams in place when building the house. In the mirror, his reflection was not that of a broken man, but of someone preparing for war. On the desk in his study, a stack of papers waited: mortgage documents, tax receipts, bank statements, every thread of his life's work. He placed them neatly into a worn leather briefcase, the same one he had carried to job interviews years ago when he was just starting out. Beside them, he slid in a small black recorder. The message Marcus had left vile and careless was stored inside, ready to be used. James snapped the case shut with finality, the sound like the click of a trigger. He walked through the house slowly, his footsteps echoing in the silence. He touched the walls one last time, the photographs, the banister, as though committing them to memory. They wanted to erase him, but he would make certain the house itself testified to who truly built it. At the front door he paused, staring out at the street bathed in early light. It was quiet, deceptively peaceful, the kind of morning that fools men into thinking the world is safe. But James knew better. Peace was a mask, and beneath it waited the cruelty of betrayal. The engine of his old Buick coughed before settling into a steady rumble. He eased the car onto the road, the briefcase beside him, his mind sharper than it had been in years. Every mile carried him further from collapse and deeper into resolve. He thought of Marcus and Vanessa still sleeping, convinced that their plan was sealed, their future secured at his expense. Let them rest easy for now, he thought. Their morning would come, and it would come with fire. His first stop was the bank. The young teller greeted him with a polite smile, her tone professional, but James saw the flicker of surprise in her eyes when she noticed his suit, his stern expression. He requested copies of every account in his name, every transaction, every line of paper that proved his life was his own. She handed the stack to him with a cautious nod, sensing the gravity in his voice when he said, "These are more important than you know." From there he drove downtown to the county courthouse. The building stood gray and imposing, its steps worn by years of men chasing justice or running from it. James climbed them with steady purpose, each step echoing like a vow. Inside, he requested property records, every deed and filing tied to his home. The clerk behind the counter glanced at his ID, then at the documents, unaware of the storm those papers concealed. James studied them closely, tracing his finger over signatures, noting dates, committing each detail to memory. If Darrell thought he could bury the theft in paperwork, he was wrong. The morning passed in silence, broken only by the shuffle of papers and the low hum of fluorescent lights. James moved with the patience of a craftsman assembling the evidence piece by piece. Each page, each receipt, each stamp was another brick in the wall he was building between himself and their scheme. They had underestimated him, but they would learn soon enough that a man who spent his life constructing foundations also knew how to tear them apart. By midday, the briefcase was heavier, stuffed with proof and possibilities. James stepped back into the sunlight, his shadow long on the courthouse steps. He loosened his tie just enough to breathe and scanned the city around him. The air felt different now. The weight of despair had lifted, replaced with something electric, dangerous. He was no longer the father waiting by the phone for scraps of affection. He was a man with a plan, and that plan would burn their illusions to ash. Driving home, he replayed the recorder, listening once more to Marcus's voice. The words no longer crushed him. They fueled him. Once he's gone, no more Sunday meals. James's grip tightened on the steering wheel, but instead of pain, he felt clarity. They thought his stories were useless relics. Soon they would discover that every lesson he ever taught, every story of grit and endurance, had been preparing him for this moment. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the road. James parked the Buick in the driveway and sat for a long moment, the briefcase resting against his leg. He imagined Marcus inside laughing with Vanessa, perhaps bragging about how easy it would be to push him aside. The thought no longer brought tears. It brought resolve as sharp as glass. He stepped out the gravel crunching beneath his shoes and carried the case into the house. That night he spread the documents across the table, each sheet lit by the dim glow of a lamp. The house was quiet, but in that silence James felt something stirring, something powerful. He wasn't just fighting for a roof and four walls. He was fighting for the truth of who he was, for the dignity his wife had urged him never to surrender. The betrayal had scarred him, but the scars were armor now, each one a reminder that he was still standing. As midnight approached, James leaned back in his chair, eyes fixed on the evidence before him. The sadness was gone, replaced by a steady fire. He was no longer the man they dismissed, no longer the burden they wanted to discard. He was the storm gathering on the horizon, silent but inevitable. And when the morning came again, Marcus and Vanessa would awaken to a world they no longer recognized, a world where the father they thought broken had become something far more dangerous. James Walker moved like a man possessed, though no trace of madness flickered in his eyes. Everything about him was deliberate, each step measured, each breath drawn as though time itself bowed to his patience. He had spent a lifetime mastering the art of labor, measured cuts, straight lines, sturdy foundations, and now those lessons sharpened into weapons. This was not rage boiling over. This was architecture. He wasn't building a house this time. He was constructing a reckoning. At the bank, the young manager tried to smile away the seriousness in his face, but James's presence cut through every veneer of politeness. He sat straight, his suit pressed, his voice calm but unyielding. He asked questions, pressed for clarifications, demanded signatures. By the time he walked out, every account was locked down, every dollar accounted for, every password changed. Marcus and Vanessa would find no hidden doorway into his finances. They thought he was careless, that old age made him soft. Instead, James left with folders under his arm, the paper trail tighter than iron chains. His next step carried him into the courthouse, the same ground Darrell had once swaggered across with false confidence. James entered quietly, his briefcase heavy at his side, and made his way to the clerk's office. The room buzzed with routine clerks stamping papers, the shuffle of documents moving across counters. But when Darrell looked up and saw him, his smile faltered. The cousin who once smirked at cookouts promising shortcuts and favors now stared into the cold eyes of a man who had come for blood. James set the recorder on the counter between them. He pressed play. Marcus's voice filled the air, casual, arrogant, conspiring. Darrell's name slid from his son's mouth like a stain, like a confession carved into stone. The blood drained from Darrell's face as his own treachery echoed back at him word for word. James said nothing for a long moment. He didn't need to. The silence pressed harder than fists, the recording louder than any accusation. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, steady, sharp enough to cut glass. "You're finished here. Try me, and I'll make sure the whole damn county hears this." Darrell sputtered, tried to recover with weak excuses, but James didn't flinch. He gathered his papers, snapped the recorder off, and left Darrell drowning in his own fear. The man who thought he could quietly erase a life with a forged file had just learned that silence could also be his undoing. From there, James made his way to the law office of Anthony Brooks. The building was all glass and steel, the kind of place that smelled of old money and victory. Anthony had once been a young man with a sharp mind and a reputation for dismantling corruption. Now he was seasoned, polished, his name spoken in hushed tones in courtrooms across the city. When James walked into his office, Anthony rose from behind the desk, his eyes narrowing at the sight of his old friend dressed for battle. James didn't waste words. He laid out the documents, the recordings, the property records, every detail arranged with the precision of a man who had been preparing for this moment his entire life. Anthony listened, his jaw tightening, his pen scratching notes across a yellow pad. When the last recording ended, the room was silent. Then Anthony leaned back in his chair, exhaled, and said, "They don't stand a chance." The words settled over James like armor. He had no need for revenge delivered in rage, no appetite for shouting matches or thrown fists. What he wanted was cleaner, sharper. Justice written into court filings, stamped by judges, enforced by law. He wanted Marcus and Vanessa to understand not just the weight of betrayal, but the inevitability of consequence. They thought they were clever, that an old man couldn't navigate systems, couldn't defend himself. They were about to learn that age didn't weaken him, it honed him. In the days that followed, James moved with quiet precision. He answered no questions, offered no explanations. To Marcus and Vanessa, he was the same quiet figure in the background, the father who let them move freely through the house. They never saw the meetings, the late nights reviewing documents, the long phone calls with Anthony. They never saw the meticulous notes he kept, recording dates and times, compiling a narrative that would trap them in their own lies. At night he sat in his chair, the house dim, listening once more to the recording of Marcus's voice. It no longer made him weep. It sharpened him. Each time the words played, he saw them for what they were: evidence. A weapon crafted not by his hand, but by his son's arrogance. The irony was bitter, but sweet. The very voice Marcus used to plot his father's erasure would become the hammer that drove him into the ground. James didn't rage. He didn't scream. He didn't let them see the storm gathering behind his eyes. He cooked dinner when they were home, nodded at their empty conversations, even endured their smug smiles. They thought he was fading. In reality, he was sharpening the blade in silence every day, drawing closer to the strike they never saw coming. Weeks passed, the plan tightening with each move. Anthony filed motions. Bank accounts were shielded. Property claims were locked down. Daryl, once loud and brash, grew quiet, his presence at family gatherings suddenly absent. Marcus and Vanessa sensed nothing, their arrogance blinding them to the quiet war unfolding under their roof. James watched them carefully, memorizing their routines, their careless laughter, their assumption of victory. Each glance at them strengthened his resolve. They believed they had stripped him of power. But power had never been loud in his life. Power had always been in his endurance, in his ability to keep going when others collapsed. By the time the first court date appeared on the horizon, James was ready. The collapse of the man they thought weak had become the rise of something unstoppable. He wasn't out for quick revenge. He was out to bury them in the very system they had tried to exploit. And when the reckoning came, it would not be with shouting or fists, but with silence, paper signatures, and the crushing weight of justice. What Marcus and Vanessa didn't know was that James Walker wasn't waiting for their downfall. He was already building it brick by brick, just as carefully as he had built the home they were trying to steal. And soon the walls would close in on them, leaving no escape, no excuses, only the truth they had tried so desperately to bury. The morning light filtered through the blinds with a quiet sharpness, as though the sun itself knew it was shining on a different man. James Walker stood in the kitchen, his navy suit still pressed from the day before, the leather briefcase resting at his side like a sentinel. Coffee steamed in his mug, untouched, its scent filling the air, but doing nothing to ease the tension coiled in his chest. He didn't need caffeine. What surged through him now was stronger, cleaner, something he hadn't felt in years. It was power. Upstairs, Marcus stirred in the guest room that had become his. Vanessa still curled beneath expensive sheets she hadn't bought. Their laughter from nights before lingered in James's memory, but it no longer cut him. It fueled him. He knew the moment would come soon when their arrogance would collide with reality, when the walls they believed were theirs would turn into cages. He moved through the house with quiet purpose, gathering the last of the evidence. The copies from the bank, the property records from the courthouse, the recording of Marcus's betrayal. Each piece slid neatly into his briefcase, a collection of weapons deadlier than fists or fury. They thought they had stripped him of everything, but what they had given him was something far more dangerous: clarity. By the time Marcus's alarm buzzed, James was already gone, his Buick rolling steadily down the street. He had no intention of being there when his son awoke. Let them rise late, confident in their illusion of control. When they realized the ground beneath them had shifted, the shock would be all the sweeter. At the law office, Anthony Brooks greeted him with a firm handshake. Papers were signed, affidavits prepared, motions filed. The machine of justice had begun to turn, and James could almost hear the grinding of its gears, slow but unstoppable. Anthony assured him the fraud case would be airtight, that Daryl's fingerprints were already smeared across the falsified documents, that Marcus's voice was enough to burn their scheme to ash. James nodded, his jaw set, his eyes steady. He didn't need reassurance. He only needed results. As he left the office, the city seemed different. Every honking horn, every rushing pedestrian, every burst of noise sounded sharper, clearer, as though the world itself was affirming his resolve. He wasn't drifting anymore. He was marching. For years he had been the quiet man in the background, the father who sacrificed in silence, who bore humiliation without protest. That man had collapsed in the kitchen 2 nights ago. What walked the streets now was someone else entirely. Back at the house, Marcus stumbled downstairs, rubbing sleep from his eyes. He called out for his father but received no answer. Vanessa appeared behind him. Irritation etched across her face. They assumed James had gone for groceries or to pay some bills, still the dutiful old man. Neither of them noticed the absence of the briefcase, the empty space on the desk where documents once lay. They had no idea their empire of lies had already begun to crumble. James drove past the factory where he had once broken his back for decades, the building still standing, its smokestacks reaching into the sky. He thought of the years spent inside, the sweat, the exhaustion, the relentless grind. Those years had built more than just muscles and calluses. They had built endurance, patience, the ability to withstand pressure until the right moment to strike. Now all of it converged in this single fight. He pulled into the churchyard where his wife was buried and stepped out of the car. The grass was damp beneath his shoes, the morning air cool against his face. He knelt by the headstone, resting his hand against the carved letters of her name. "I kept my promise," he whispered. "They tried to erase me. They tried to erase us. But they'll learn what it means to underestimate what we built." His voice was low, but every word carried the weight of steel. The wind rustled through the trees, and for a moment he felt her beside him, steady, unyielding, the echo of her words in his heart. "Never let anyone strip you of your dignity, not even family." He stood, brushed the dirt from his knees, and walked back to the car, his steps firm, his shoulders squared. By the time he returned home, Marcus and Vanessa were already plotting their day. Vanessa talked about redecorating the living room, Marcus about a meeting with Daryl. James listened quietly, his expression unreadable. They thought his silence was weakness. In truth, it was the calm before the storm. That evening he sat at the kitchen table, the same place where humiliation had once drowned him. But now the air felt different. The documents were secure. The attorney prepared the case inevitable. He had transformed pain into strategy, betrayal into ammunition. For the first time in a long while he felt not just alive, but unstoppable. The clock ticked toward midnight, and James Walker leaned back in his chair, eyes fixed on the shadows stretching across the walls. His son thought of him as a burden. Vanessa thought of him as obsolete. Daryl thought of him as a mark. They were all wrong. What they had unleashed was a storm that would not pass quietly. And as the night deepened, he vowed again, this time, not with sorrow, but with fire, that they would never forget the day they tried to break him. Because the reckoning he had set in motion would not simply end their scheme. It would redefine every memory they had of the man they thought weak. The true lesson was about to begin, and it would be written in their ruin. Life often tests us in the harshest ways, and betrayal from family cuts deeper than any wound from the outside world. James Walker's story is not just about pain, it is about resilience, dignity, and the refusal to be erased. As we grow older, society sometimes whispers that our value has passed, that our voices no longer matter. But his journey reminds us that wisdom, patience, and endurance are powerful tools, sharper than anger and louder than silence. The strength to protect what we've built does not fade with age. It transforms, becoming quieter, steadier, and far more unshakable. For older generations, the lesson is clear. Never surrender your dignity, even to those you love most. Stand tall, defend what you've earned, and remember that justice often comes not from rage, but from clarity and resolve. Life may try to strip you of your worth, but you are never powerless. If this story spoke to you, share where you're watching from in the comments, and subscribe for more powerful tales of resilience and justice.